The 1800s was the start of the abolition that would change the United States forever. Blacks were gradually becoming more accepted in the United States. Slavery was being looked down upon more than any other time in history. This was the perfect time for a leader that can persuade people no matter which side they were on. A leader with an amazing skill of speaking, so amazing people didn't believe he was once a slave. Even more persuading and skillful with his writing. A leader that can connect with people because he's experienced all of it. The true horrors of slavery first-handedly. Frederick Douglass was that leader. Frederick Douglass was a very vital person in the abolition by exposing the horrors of slavery, having persuasive speeches, and becoming a national icon for the abolitionist. In February of 1818, in Talbot, Maryland, Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. Unlike most slave black males in the 1800s, he did not work in the fields, but was a house slave. He lived as an ordinary slave and was separated from his father, who is unknown till this day. He lived with his mother beside him, and it was one of the hardest things for Douglass. He would have witnessed his mom being tortured, and his mother would sometimes see him whipped. His mother died when he was at the age of 10. He was an ordinary slave until the age of 12, when he was accidentally taught a few letters. After that, he taught himself how to read and write and was reading newspapers secretly by the age of 13. By reading these newspapers, he was fascinated by how many political debates were in there, and he received a lot of information on what was going on in the outside world. And by the age of 20, after a failed attempt, he escaped. He then continued to become one of the most influential people in the abolition. After escaping to New York, he then starts the new beginning of a soon-to-be great career. He then took the name of Douglass and married a free African-American woman named Anna Murray, who had previously helped Douglass escape. Later, they moved to Bedford, Massachusetts, and Frederick then got involved in the abolition movement. With him joining this, no one knew what he would soon be able to accomplish. One day, Douglass sees a public debate, and he then chimed in and blows everyone's mind by showing how persuasive he really was. A man by the name of William Lloyd Garrison was there, and was astonished by his skills. Garrison was easily the most famous white abolitionist in history. Garrison invited him to become an agent for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Frederick Douglass quickly goes up in the chain of command in the program, and in 2 years gets a very vital role. He then starts his 4-year lecture tour and begins gaining popularity. Soon, he is so popular and starts gaining a large white audience. Then, in 1845, he writes his biography about his time as a slave, and it blew up like nothing he has ever done before. Later that year, because of the popularity of his book, he was forced to run away to Europe because he was still a runaway slave by law. In Europe, he starts his own lecture tour and starts selling his book in small cities. He soon gained more popularity from the European people. They loved him so much a large group of people got together and bought his freedom. He returned to the United States in the spring of 1847 to continue his work. Frederick Douglass then continued his work to becoming one of the most popular and important figures in the abolition. Frederick Douglass was a very vital person in the abolition by exposing the horrors of slavery, having persuasive speeches, and becoming a national icon for the abolitionists. Frederick Douglass was one of the largest icons in the world during the abolition. We can start from his book. This book, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, was made to prove that he was a slave. It is about his life as a slave, and it sold immensely. It sold over 70,000 copies within the first 5 years of its publish. He also went on a 4-year lecture tour, traveling all over the United States. He became very popular once he did this because people had not seen a black person with amazing speaking and writing skills. As Deborah Gillen said, they had never seen a black male speak so well. It became the talk of the city. Quintard Taylor also mentions, this made him the talk of the town as more and more people went to his conventions. Another thing Frederick Douglass did was assisted 400 fugitives with food and water. This made huge headlines around the world, showing how generous and humane he was. Frederick Douglass was such a persuasive speaker that his speeches had influenced the abolition to new heights. Douglass's speeches were so good that he had persuaded people to join or be part of the abolition movement. When people saw that an African-American male could speak so powerful, they were astonished with shock and immediately wanted to follow him. Some of his greatest speeches were towards persuading non-slave owning Southerners. This was very hard to get the owners to support this movement because they knew people who have owned slaves didn't support the movement whatsoever. But Douglass's persuasive acts made them see what he was seeing. General Robert Lee said that he was a gifted orator, was speaking out regularly against slavery. He gave amazing lectures about the Union goal to abolish slavery. Another quote from the address to the Civil Rights Movement, Frederick Douglass said, "No man could put a chain around the ankle of his fellow without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." This quote helped the slave owners think twice about what they were doing to the blacks. While in Europe, still as a runaway slave, he kept conducting more speeches that made people buy his freedom, which was very expensive for a runaway slave. With Douglass's amazing speeches, this made him a very important symbol for the abolition and a unique voice for humanism as well as social justice. Another reason why Frederick Douglass was vital in the abolition was how he exposed the horrors of slavery. Most abolitionists couldn't describe their time as a slave because most of them did not have experience. Those few that actually experienced it did not have the skills and knowledge to expose it. Douglass had the knowledge. When Douglass escaped, people did not believe he used to be a slave because of his immense knowledge in literature. To prove people that he was a slave, he wrote his biography and described his time as a slave more accurately than anyone has ever done before. He would talk about the smallest of details. A quote from Douglass, "Have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence for their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to convince of a greater mistake. Slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. The song of a slave represents the sores of his heart, and he is relieved by them, only as the aching heart is relieved by its tears. At least, such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. Crying for joy and singing for joy were alike uncommon for me while in the jaws of slavery. The singing of a man cast away upon a desolate island might as appropriately considered the evidence of contentment and happiness. As the singing of a slave, the songs of the one and the other are prompted by the same emotion. Even more, all the way they used to torture blacks." He had memorized the things his owners had told him, and he quoted them exactly. This was the reason why his book was so popular. People that had never experienced being a slave had never seen or heard what exactly goes on those plantations. His book was not the only way he would expose the horrors. On his 4-year lecture tour, he talked about all the experiences that he went through, and more people would hear the horrors. He also did this in Europe, where people had no clue of what happened. His autobiography and his speeches made northern people see the horrors of slavery. It influenced non-slave owners and European citizens to become part of the abolition. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist for the rest of his life. He was always preaching and writing until the day he died. His wife, Anna Murray, died in 1882. Frederick then married a woman by the name of Helen Pitts in 1884. To having 5 children and lived in Washington, D.C., he started his own newspaper after remarriage, and it was called the North Star, and he was the editor-in-chief. Douglass also continued his speaking engagements and travel, both in the United States and abroad. With his new wife, Helen, Douglass traveled to England, Ireland, France, Italy, Egypt, and Greece. From 1886 to 1887, Douglass also became known for advocating Irish Home Rule and supported Charles Stuart Parnell in Ireland. While working on the abolition, he also got involved in women's rights. February 20th of 1895, Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. During that meeting, he was brought to the platform and received a standing ovation. Shortly after he returned home, Frederick Douglass died of a massive heart attack at the age of 77 years old.